Thank you so much. It is really a wonderful pleasure to be here, and so thanks. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts into our discussion. So I am coming to this from the point of view of a cognitive scientist, a psychologist, neuroscientist with a bit of a background in philosophy, and I'll be building on some of the themes that Professor Hausman discussed, but trying to get inside the head a little bit more, and in particular, talking about the interplay between, on the one hand, intuitions, emotions, fast thinking, you might call it, and then on the other hand, reasoning, deliberation, what you might call slow thinking, and the ways in which these things work well and the ways in which these things don't work well, especially when we're trying to build a larger sense of us. Not advance. Oh, there we go. Okay. So this is going to be a quick talk, but covering a lot. In the first few slides, I want to talk a little bit about what are morality's features. If you think of it as a set of mechanisms in our head, what is it designed to do? What problem is moral thinking designed to solve? And then what are the bugs in the system? What are the ways in which this goes wrong, at least from a certain point of view, depending on what we would like our moral brains to accomplish? And then finally, I'll say just a few words about what it would take to fix these bugs, at least relative to our goals, people who are interested in building a broader sense of us. So a familiar story about the theme of cooperation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. For the uninitiated, the story goes like this. You have these herders that share this common pasture, and these are rational, self-interested herders straight out of the economics department. And they say, should I add more animals to my herd? And they say, well, what do I get for that? I have more animals to sell at market. That's good. What's the downside? Well, not much. They're just grazing on this pasture that I don't have to maintain. So I'll add more animals, but at some point there are more animals than the pasture can support, and everybody ends up being worse off as a result of these decisions. And so the tragedy of the commons illustrates the fundamental problem of cooperation, the tension between me and us, what's good for oneself as an individual and what's good for the larger group of which one is a part. Now, in my view, what morality is about at its core is having a way to solve this problem. That is, how do you get people to be a little bit more concerned with us, that is, with other people, as opposed to being only concerned about me? And there are a lot of different mechanisms and sub-mechanisms, I think, that have different historical explanations. What I want to focus on is sort of the most basic continence-level psychological distinction in the mechanisms that make this possible. So my preferred metaphor for this division within our brains is a camera like this. So this is now an old camera. This is the camera I got when my son was born 12 years ago. But it still does the job for our purposes. So what's nice about a camera like this for me, because I'm not a very good photographer, is that it has these automatic settings. So you can just put it in landscape mode or portrait mode and point and shoot. You've got a pretty good photo for your standard photographic need. On those rare occasions when I want to do something fancy, I've got an artistic impulse, I can put the camera in manual mode and adjust the f-stop and everything else by hand and get exactly the shot I want with my goals and the specific situation in mind. Now, you might say, well, okay, well, which is better, automatic settings or the manual mode? And you'll immediately say it's not that one is inherently better than the other. It's that they serve different functions. That if you're doing something that's a standard thing that's, that the manufacturer had in mind, then the automatic settings are very efficient, and you're less likely to make a mistake if you don't really know what you're doing, like me. But if you're doing something special, something different, you have different goals, or you're in an unusual situation, then you want to use their manual mode and get everything exactly right and take the risk that you might make the wrong choice. So what does this have to do with the human mind? Well, the idea is that our gut feelings, our emotions, and other kinds of intuitions are like those automatic settings. Based on our experience, which can be either our personal experience or the experience we've absorbed through our culture, or even the biological experience of our ancestors, we have these gut reactions that give us pretty good advice most of the time for typical situations, at least from a certain perspective. Our manual mode is our capacity for deliberate reasoning, to actually think explicitly about what situation am I in, what are my goals, and how do I use the facts of this situation to choose actions that are going to get me to my goals. So with that in mind, let's apply this perspective, this idea about thinking fast and slow, to put it in Daniel Kahneman's terms, to the basic problem of morality, the problem of cooperation. So this is research done with David Rand, who's now at Yale, and Martin Novak, who's just across the way at the Program for Evolutionary Dynamics. the laboratory version of the public goods game, of the tragedy of the commons is called the public goods game. So the way this works is you have, say, 4 people come into the lab. Each of them gets an allotment of $10, and they have a choice. They can keep all of their money, or they can put some or all of their money into a common pool. Whatever goes into the common pool gets doubled by the experimenters, and then it gets divided equally among all 4 people, regardless of who put in what. So if you do the math, you realize that the way you maximize your income, at least if you're only doing this once, is to keep your money. That way you get your $10 and you get your share, your quarter of whatever got put in and doubled as a result of everybody else. If what you care about is maximizing the total outcome, the greater good, then you put all of your money in, because that maximizes the amount that is productively doubled by the experimenters. So the us-ish thing to do is put it all in. The me-ish thing to do is to put none in, and you can do anything in between. And what we wanted to know is what kind of thinking is leading people to be more selfish or more generous, or is there no difference in the kind of thinking that people are exhibiting in this case? So what we did was we had people make these kinds of choices, and in some cases they were unconstrained with respect to time. They could go as fast or as slow as they wanted. And in this particular study, people put in on average about 60% of their endowment that they had at the beginning when they were under no time pressure or any kind of constraint. Other times we had people have to decide quickly. So you say you have to make your decision in less than 10 seconds. And in that case, on average, people put more money in, suggesting that the impulse to contribute is a more intuitive kind of response. And then consistent with that, if we say you have to slow down, you have to take at least 10 seconds, people put in less. So this is consistent with the idea and consistent with what Professor Hausman said, which is that our cooperative impulses are, in some sense, truly impulses, that they're more intuitive, and that if we stop and reflect and we say, well, I'm only doing this game once, and maybe other people won't put the money in, maybe I'll just keep the money for myself, and you do that utility calculation like a good, rational, self-interested economist, you might be less likely to put the money in. Now, you might come away from this thinking, aha, so this means people are innately good or intuitively pro-social. But I don't think that's the case. That people's personal experiences and cultural experiences make a big difference. So in one version of this study, we asked people before and said, what do you think of the people that you interact with in your daily life? And some people said, I trust them. We'll call those people who think others are cooperative. Other people said, I don't really trust them so much. Now, for the people who said, I trust the people I interact with in my daily life, they showed this intuitive cooperation effect quite strongly. The faster they went, the more likely they were to contribute. For people who said, I don't trust the people I interact with in my daily life, we don't see anything related to time. And the idea is that their first thought is, I'm keeping my money. And their second thought is, I'm keeping my money. And as a result, it doesn't matter whether they go fast or slow, right? But there's wide cultural variation on this. And we'll talk about that in a second. This study is a stand-in for a much larger literature that's really giving the same lesson, which is that our social behaviors, the core of our sociality, the core of our morality is emotional. And you can think of it as sort of filling in this sort of 2x2 matrix where we have positive emotions, which are kind of cognitive carrots that motivate us to do things in a positive way, negative emotions that are cognitive sticks that are punishing when we experience them, and they can be applied to the self or they can be applied to other people. So if I have loving, friendly feelings towards you, then I'll say you're a fellow herder of mine and I want to put my money in, and that's going to positively, intuitively motivate me to be cooperative. I might also think, gosh, I would feel terribly guilty or embarrassed. People are cooperative, they'll have my gratitude, and if other people are not, then they'll have my anger and disgust, etc. So all of these different feelings that might seem sort of just unrelated are actually just different strategies for motivating cooperation, for getting ourselves and others into the cooperative space, either with emotional carrots or sticks, positive feelings or negative feelings. Okay, so what about the manual mode? How does that work? Well, I think the easiest way to see manual mode at work is with classic philosophical moral dilemmas, which takes us into a territory that is near and dear to my heart as a philosopher, which we affectionately call trolleyology. So here's one of these classic dilemmas. The trolley is headed towards these 5 people. You can hit a switch that will turn the trolley away from the 5 and onto one person. If you ask most people, is it okay to hit the switch to redirect the trolley away from the 5, but it'll kill the 1? Most people say, yes, that's okay. So what's going on here? Well, people do the cost-benefit calculation. In this case, the idea is that there's not much of an emotional response. And as a result, just like the old utilitarian philosophers Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, they say, well, it's better to save more lives. The greater good prevails. Now, consider this case. The trolley's headed towards these 5 people, and this time the only way to save them is to push this big guy off of the footbridge and onto the tracks. And he'll die. You'll sort of use him as a trolley stopper, but it'll save the 5 people. Now, I know this is somewhat unrealistic, but you've all been to the movies. I know you can suspend disbelief, and we've controlled for this in experiments. Here again, people get the idea that it would save more lives, and some people will say that it's better to push the guy off the footbridge, but most people don't. And the reason seems to be that there's more of an emotional response to this kind of case, and I can talk a little bit more about that. And as a result, just like Immanuel Kant, people say the ends don't justify the means, it's wrong here. But what really seems to be driving it is this emotional response, but it's in competition with this cost-benefit thinking. Now, what I just gave you was essentially a theory. What's the evidence for it? Well, now there's been a lot of evidence for this over the past 20 years. I'll just tell you about one experiment done using patients, patients like the modern day version of Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage was a railroad foreman in Vermont, a little north of here in the 19th century, who got an iron spike as part of an accident through a part of his brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex that is a kind of hub for emotional signals that bear on decision making. So you can think of this as sort of knocking out a key emotional center. So what would you expect people with this kind of brain damage to do in this kind of case? Well, if there's a reflective, slow response, manual mode says better to save more lives, and you have this emotional response that says, that just feels wrong pushing the guy off the footbridge like that. If you knock that out, then you would expect more people to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. And that's exactly what you find with these patients. They're about twice as likely in this particular case to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. Incidentally, you also see the same effect in psychopaths, that is, in particularly low anxiety psychopaths. So, whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, you knock out the emotional response that says don't push people off of high places, and this is the response that you get. But it's not all nasty people who might necessarily give this response. So this was a project done by Xin Chang, who is now in graduate school at the Ed School here. We had done some experiments with a few Buddhist monks who gave very interesting responses to these dilemmas, but we didn't have enough to do a study, so she decided to go to Tibet and try out these kinds of cases on people there. And so she interviewed 49 Buddhist monks and 43 lay Tibetans. She also tested people in her hometown in China and then here in Boston. And she found that here in Boston, a minority of people, both lay Americans and Christian ministers, say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge, most saying that it's wrong. Similar in China, lay Tibetans, 64% of them said it was okay to push the guy off the footbridge, and a whopping 83% of the Buddhist monks said it was okay. Now, these are not psychopaths. These are not people who say that it's okay to take human life. On the contrary, quite the opposite. But for reasons I don't have time to get into in this talk, we could talk about it maybe later in the discussion, they have a cultural tradition that allows certain people, if they are coming from a noble place and truly thinking about the greater good, to take a kind of action that would otherwise be wrong. And they specifically referenced these Buddhist teachings when they gave those answers. So the point here is just cultural variation, and different people can reach the same conclusion for very different reasons. Psychopaths and Buddhist monks, very different psychologically, but coming to the same conclusions about these kinds of cases. Okay, so we've talked about the features. What about the bugs? Where do things tend to go wrong? And now we get my sequel to Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, which I call the Tragedy of Common Sense Morality. So it goes like this. So you have these herders over here who have solved the tragedy of the commons in a distinctive way. These are your communist herders who say, not only are we going to have a common pasture, we're going to have a common herd. And that way everybody's on the same page. There's no me versus us. It's all us, and that's fine. Now here you have your free market capitalist herders who say, we're not going to have a common herd, and we're not even going to have a common pasture anymore. We will privatize the pasture. We'll have a system of property rights that ensures that everybody retains their sheep and that nobody interferes with everybody else, and that's how things are going to be done. Now, these are both cooperative in the sense that they're systems where everybody has to follow the rules in order for things to work, and they may work better or worse depending on what they're trying to do. Now, these tribes may differ in other ways, different religions where they pray to different gods, they have different rituals, different rules about society. Are women allowed to be herders? Here they say yes, there they say no. Are we going to have health insurance, public health insurance in case our sheep get sick? Can you defend your herd with an assault weapon? Lots of questions about the organizing structure of the society where these tribes disagree. And then one hot, dry summer, the forest burns down, And then the rains come, and there's this lovely pasture in between. And the two tribes look at this, and they say, wow, that's a very nice pasture. And they move in. And the question is, what is going to happen here in the middle when these tribes with different senses of us, different ideas about how a society should be organized, when they have to exist in the common space? Is one just going to annihilate the other, or are they going to find a way to live together, and if so, on what terms? This is the modern moral dilemma in one goofy slide. That this is the problem of morality in the modern world. It's not just about individuals forming a group, learning to not be completely selfish. It's about coming together of groups with different interests and different values in a common space. That's the modern moral problem right there, and it requires, I'm going to try to convince you, a different moral psychology. Okay, so what's interesting about the tribes in competition is that they can be very different and very similar at the same time, right? That is, in terms of what they want done, could not be more opposite. But in terms of the kind of thinking and psychology that goes into it, it can be nearly identical, as these two pictures of an American woman and a woman from Gaza strongly suggest. I want to give an example going back to our favorite sort of laboratory cooperation game, the public goods game. So this is work done by Benedict Herman and colleagues. Well, I'll say where they went around the world and played a repeated public goods game. This is the game where you put your money into the common pool or don't, in different cities around the world, right? But the same rules, same understanding everywhere. Wanted to see how do people in different cultures play. And what they found, they did it in 16 cities, but I'm going to pull out these 9 because they illustrate the 3 main patterns. So you have places like Boston and Copenhagen and St. Gallen in Switzerland, where right from the start, people walk in and they put their money down and say, we can all cooperate here. And then they do, and they walk away with a lot of money. There are other places, like in Seoul and Melbourne, where they start out kind of in the middle, and then they ramp up. And what's going on here is after every round, the people have the opportunity to punish other players anonymously. So if you cooperated and someone else didn't, you can pay the experimenter $1, and the experimenter will take $3 away from that person. So it's the economic equivalent of bapping somebody on the head with a stick and saying, come on, get with the cooperative program. And what happens in these cities is the non-cooperators get punished, and they say, okay, fine, I'll be good, I'll cooperate. And by the end, it all looks like lovely Copenhagen. But then in other places, Istanbul, Riyadh, Athens, cooperation starts out low, and it never goes up. So what's going on there? And what happened to the wonderful power of pro-social punishment? Well, it turns out there was something else at work in these places, which the experimenters named antisocial punishment. People in these places, some of them who didn't cooperate, would punish the people who did. Why? Why would you pay to take money away from somebody who gave you and other people money? Well, they interviewed them afterwards and said, why would you do that? And they say, you know, I don't like this whole thing. I don't know who you are. I don't know who these people are. This whole thing stinks, and this is just my way of putting up my middle finger to your whole operation, right? And what it suggests is the whole thing made them uncomfortable, that they were being asked to be cooperative outside their circle. And this tendency towards antisocial punishment is really accounted for the differences in the total productivity of these different groups. The more antisocial punishment, the lower the take. Now, I've been to Athens. I haven't been to the other 2 cities. The people there are very nice. It's not like these are psychopaths. They're very lovely people, right? But their sense of us is more narrow, at least when it comes to whether or not they're willing to put their money on the line. Now, this was done a few years ago. Maybe things have changed. But the general point is that cultures differ not only in their norms, but in how wide their sense of us is, right? And this can be a good thing or a bad thing. But in this case, the people in Athens could have made a lot more money, and they could have been like the people in Copenhagen. They were basically leaving money on the table, which they would have liked to have had, because they couldn't temporarily at least broaden their sense of us. And of course, this may be true in real life. If you look at what's going on in Greece versus other parts of Europe, you might think if they had a wider sense of us, if they had different institutions, they might be more successful, or maybe not. Okay, so another modern moral problem. So if you're driving along and there's a guy who's bleeding by the side of the road, and you pull over and you see what's going on, and the person says, please take me to the hospital. If I don't get there soon, I'm probably going to lose my leg. It'll have to be amputated. And you say to yourself, well, I'd like to help this guy, but he's bleeding. I just got these new leather seats in my car. He's going to bleed all over the place. Maybe I'll let him go. How many of you think it's morally fine, or how many think it would be morally terrible to let this guy bleed by the side of the road because you're worried about your leather seats? Okay, so a lot of hands going up. How many people think it's fine? No one's willing to put their hand up. Okay. So now we have this case. a familiar case. We live it every day. You get a letter from Oxfam or UNICEF saying, please make a donation. We can use this money to provide much needed food or medicine for somebody on the other side of the world. And you'd say, I'd like to help this person, but I was going to get some new leather seats in my car. I'm saving up my money for that nice upholstery. I'll let it go. Now, how many of you think you're a terrible person if you forego an opportunity to give money to UNICEF, assuming that they'll do good work with it, right? So what's the difference here? So the philosopher Peter Singer many years ago said, it seems like there's a difference and there isn't, right? And this has been highly controversial. What I and my collaborator Jay Musin wanted to do is see if we can do this as a tighter experiment and try to understand what's going on with our psychology. So in our version, you're vacationing in a lovely but poor country. You have your little cottage overlooking the coast, and there's a devastating typhoon that hits, and there's destruction and suffering, and people badly need food and medicine below. And the question is, should you help them? It turns out the best way to help them is not to go down there yourself, but just to make a donation online to the Red Cross, let's say. Do you have an obligation to give? That's the question. Then we ask other people, randomly selected, the same question, except we said, you're not over there, your friend is over there, and you're looking on Facebook, you're getting a live feed, you see everything they see, and you can donate to the Red Cross just as well. Do you have an obligation to give? And the difference between these two is striking. And when you're over there, 68% of people said you have an obligation to give, whereas when it's just your friend over there, it's about half as many. Now, this effect varies depending on exactly how you ask the question, but the point is that at least in some circumstances, it seems like just mere physical distance is having this effect. And what this is probably about is not literally distance, but social distance. How far away from the center of us does it feel when I imagine myself being there versus not? Is that a bug? Does that make a lot of sense? Well, I guess it depends on your values. Another example of this. So it's often been noted, you've probably heard the apocryphal quote from Stalin that a death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. That when it comes to saving lives, the more lives there are, the less it seems to matter, or less each additional life seems to matter. So more lives, less value. You get this kind of moral diminishing returns. So Amitai Shenhav and I did an experiment where we had people make judgments about saving different numbers of people with different probabilities. And the long and short of it is that the part of the brain that seems to be keeping track of these probabilities and values is the same basic mammalian reward circuitry that a rodent would use to try to make decisions about foraging. Do I go for the easy food over here, or do I go for the really good food over there, but I might not make it because it's far away or something like that, right? And if you're a rodent, it makes sense to have this diminishing returns built into your value function. That is, you don't have a fridge. Once you've got a certain amount of food, that's it. It doesn't get any better than that, or it doesn't get much better. And this is true for almost all of the goods in our natural history, right? And then all of a sudden, now we in the modern world have the opportunity to create policies that could save 100 lives, or 1,000 lives, or 10,000 lives. And to our rodent valuation systems, it all just kind of sounds like a lot, right? And here, if sort of understanding the basic neurobiological mechanisms can give you a kind of explanation for why we might be so morally innumerate, right? From a certain perspective, from a manual mode perspective, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. Why should the 1,000th life you can save be worth any less than the 5th life you can save, or the 1st life you can save? But in terms of the way we represent value, in roughly the same way that a rodent or a monkey does, that's the natural way to do it. But maybe we can get past that. Another example of bugs in our thinking. So here's a footbridge case, trolley headed for the 5. Is it okay to push the guy who's now wearing a big backpack? In this sample, 30% of people say it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. If you make it so that instead of pushing the guy, you hit this switch that drops him through a trap door onto the tracks, now you get twice as many people saying that it's okay. So, if you ask them, is it okay to kill someone in order to save 5 other people? You would say, well, that depends. Are you pushing with your hands, or are you hitting a switch, right? No one thinks that that really matters morally, but the way we record the value of things has a lot to do with the physical nature of the act. And this, I think, has a lot to do with how we think about issues in medicine, for example, physician-assisted suicide and other things like that. And if you up the numbers, if you say, push the guy off the footbridge, and it'll stop a trolley from setting off explosives that'll blow up a dam that will flood a city of 1 million people, pushing to save 1 million lives, you get something like this. Like the difference between pushing and hitting a switch is worth about 1 million lives to your rodent moral brain. That's what I was just saying. Okay, so what do we do about this? Well, running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to give a complete answer. But here are some general thoughts. These basic emotional responses, this is the core of morality. It's our fast thinking, our intuitions enable us to turn a bunch of individuals into an us, to not be completely selfish. Well, if the problem of the modern world is not morality, or us versus, or me versus us, but rather us versus them, then we need something like a metamorality. That is, just as morality is essentially about governing the interactions between a bunch of individuals in a tribe, we need to have some kind of higher order system that governs the interactions for tribes on a larger kind of global stage. And this is not something that comes naturally to us. It's not something that's intuitive, although perhaps it can be made intuitive, and perhaps it has to some extent. But this is very much going to be a manual mode phenomenon. And what that means is that it's often going to clash with our moral intuitions, our gut sense of right and wrong. So if you're trying to envision what a global metamorality would look like, I think we can guess about what certain things are going to have to change. To some extent, at least, we're going to have to fix our tribalistic tendencies. If everybody thinks that my tribe is more important, more valuable than your tribe, or my tribe's God is the one true God, and whatever that God said or its interpreters say, that's what's right for now and forever, it's hard to see how we're going to be able to get along. So we're going to have to sort of get outside our local us's to a certain extent. And I think we're also going to have to be less innumerate, right? We're going to have to really think not just in terms of which actions feel right or wrong as actions, or feel like the behavior of a virtuous person as opposed to someone who's not so virtuous. We have to think about these things at a geeky kind of policy level if we really want to make the kinds of trade-offs that we have to make. And in order to make trade-offs, there has to be some kind of common currency. If you've got two tribes that have different interests and different values, then if you want to weigh them, then there has to be some metric that's used for the weighing, right? And a moral philosophy like that is going to have to ultimately put values on a common scale. And that is something that we are very reluctant to do. There are some moral philosophies that have advocated this now for 2 centuries. This is the utilitarian consequentialist tradition. And if you go to philosophy departments, almost everybody hates them. They hate them because they're subordinating our intuitive sense of right and wrong and justice to this geeky calculus of the greater good. Maybe that's not the right approach, but the question is, what kind of system is going to provide the kind of common currency that we need to resolve these problems? So that's that, and I just want to say thanks to the people who actually did the work I described and some of the people who funded it, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts.